For centuries, the image of the Viking has remained frozen in a single iconic frame. A bearded warrior with an axe in one hand and a horned helmet perched menacingly on his head, a figure of unstoppable masculine aggression. From Hollywood epics to dusty textbooks, the Viking world is so often portrayed as a man's world, bloody, brutal, and male-dominated. Yet this image is only half the truth. Behind those warriors, and often beside them, stood women who wielded a very different kind of power, one woven into the very fabric of Norse society. This forgotten power has been hidden not because it was weak, but because it was so fundamentally threatening to the narratives that followed. Unlike their counterparts in the rest of medieval Europe, Viking women occupied a strikingly unique position. They could inherit land, initiate divorce, own property, and run households in the absence of their husbands. In a world where most women were treated as extensions of their fathers or husbands, Norse women were, by comparison, remarkably autonomous. This wasn't accidental. Norse society, though warlike and hierarchical, recognized the value of balance. While men explored and raided distant lands, it was women who maintained the stability of their communities, ensuring that bloodlines, trade, and the passing of traditions endured. Power in their world didn't only flow from the blade. It flowed from knowledge, cunning, and survival. Evidence of their autonomy doesn't come from romantic retellings or feminist reinterpretations. It comes from law codes, runestones, and the sagas themselves. The Icelandic Grágis law code recognized a woman's right to divorce and take her dowry back. Burial sites discovered in Scandinavia reveal women buried with tools of trade, religious symbols, and sometimes even weapons, indicators of status, authority, and personal identity. Some women were even seeresses, spiritual leaders who guided communities through rituals and prophecy. They weren't just caretakers, they were negotiators, landowners, and often feared mystics. But perhaps the most enduring and controversial image is that of the Shieldmaiden, the female warrior who rode into battle alongside men. For years, historians dismissed Shieldmaidens as legend, a product of Norse mythology or poetic invention. Yet recent archaeological discoveries have begun to challenge that dismissal. In 2017, a warrior grave in Birka, Sweden, long assumed to belong to a man, was confirmed through DNA testing to have belonged to a woman. She was buried with weapons, a game board symbolizing military strategy, and horse remains, suggesting a respected martial role. The implications were seismic. What had once been dismissed as fantasy may well have been grounded in truth. Shieldmaidens existed at the crossroads of fact and folklore, and that's what makes them so compelling. Their stories, from Logatha, who fought beside Ragnar Lodbrok, to Hervair, who wielded the cursed sword Turfing, occupy that shadowy space between myth and memory. These women were fierce, sometimes violent, and always unpredictable. Whether historical or legendary, they reflected a cultural willingness to see women not only as nurturers but also as destroyers, protectors, and sovereigns in their own right. This was not just tolerance, it was admiration wrapped in fear. And it is in this space, this narrow crack between recorded history and legendary tale, that the story of one woman begins to form. A woman whose name may not be carved into schoolbooks, but whose actions were so bold, so disturbing, and so unfathomable that they survived the brutal filters of time, censorship, and patriarchal storytelling. She did not beg for power, she took it. She did not seek approval, she demanded fear. She was born into blood, thrived in chaos, and left behind a legacy that even her enemies could not erase. By the end of this chapter, we are left not with a conclusion, but with a question. If Viking society could produce such women, armed not only with swords but with intellect, resolve, and a total disregard for the limits placed upon them, then what kind of woman would be remembered as the most dangerous of them all? In the next chapter, we begin to unravel that mystery, starting with her birth in exile, her rise among outlaws, and her first taste of power. Born into the roar of wind and ice, Freydis Eric's daughter entered the world not in peace, but in exile. Her father, Eric the Red, had already carved out a reputation as one of the most dangerous and volatile men of his age. A man who killed his neighbors in Norway, was expelled, and then exiled again from Iceland for more bloodshed. By the time Freydis was born, her family had been forced to the edges of the known world, settling in Greenland, a desolate and unforgiving land Eric had marketed to settlers as a paradise. In truth, it was a harsh, lonely frontier. It was in this crucible of isolation, survival, and violence that Freydis would be forged. She was not raised in the quiet shadows of her brothers. On the contrary, she was a child of tension, growing up alongside Leif Erikson, who would become a Christian explorer and symbol of piety, while she embodied the old ways, pagan, fierce, and unapologetic. While Leif was sent away for education and diplomacy, Freydis remained close to the raw, elemental life of Greenland. She learned how to hunt, barter, and defend, not just with words, but with blades. There were no princesses in her world. There were only survivors and the dead. Unlike many girls in medieval Europe, Freydis wasn't sheltered from hardship. From a young age, she witnessed violence as a form of communication and power. Her father's sense of justice was swift and personal. Disputes were resolved with axes, and grudges often ended in blood. These weren't aberrations. They were lessons. Freydis learned that authority came not from title or birthright, but from action. Her worldview was shaped by the notion that to be respected, one had to be feared, or at least never seen as weak. The household of Eric the Red was more than just a family. It was a power center in exile. Eric's longhouse was filled with exiles, opportunists, seers, and warriors. Freydis grew up in a court of chaos, overhearing tales of gods and monsters, of kings betrayed and worlds beyond the sea. She sat quietly in corners, watching men argue over land, trade, and revenge, absorbing the subtle mechanics of dominance. Her earliest education wasn't just in literacy or religion, it was in reading people, in knowing when to act, and in recognizing how power moved through a room. Greenland, while isolated, was not disconnected. Ships came and went, bringing news from Iceland and Norway, bringing stories of exploration to the west. Leif's legendary journey to Vinland, often portrayed as a peaceful Christian mission, was in fact fueled by older ambitions: land, honor, and legacy. Freydis watched as her brother's fame grew, even as she remained behind. But her gaze never lowered. If anything, the contrast between Leif's holy narrative and her own rough, pagan roots only hardened her resolve. She would not be forgotten. She would find her own path to glory, one not built on diplomacy, but on raw power. There are hints, even in the sagas, that Freydis was difficult to control from an early age. Her temper was notorious, her defiance legendary. Where Leif sought compromise, Freydis pushed boundaries. She did not beg for permission. She acted first and let the consequences fall where they may. Family politics were no exception. Some accounts suggest that even her own brothers feared her potential, that her ambitions weren't simply loud, but dangerously calculated. In a family of outlaws and legends, she was perhaps the most unpredictable. Freydis's early adulthood is mostly shrouded in the mists of oral tradition. The written record of her youth is thin, but the silence is telling. In Norse sagas, silence often surrounds figures who defied the roles they were meant to play. She was not memorialized in the gentle tones of daughterhood or sisterhood. She was spoken of with the same caution used for warriors or berserkers. This cultural omission suggests that she was not merely eccentric, but transgressive. A woman who refused to behave like a woman, who instead demanded the space usually reserved for dangerous men. What little we do know indicates that Freydis was not content with domestic life. She entered into a marriage that seemed more strategic than affectionate. Her husband, a man named Thorvard, is mostly a footnote in her saga, overshadowed completely by her dominance. Unlike other women who wielded influence through their husbands or sons, Freydis operated directly. She gave commands, she made plans, and she led. This inversion of power, particularly in a society where leadership was still publicly male, would make her both feared and resented. It's important to remember that the Viking world didn't necessarily scorn powerful women, but it demanded that they remain exceptional. Women like Freydis were allowed to exist only if their presence was undeniable. If a woman could outfight men, outthink rivals, and outlast enemies, she could earn a place. But the moment she faltered, society would be ready to reassert its hierarchy. Freydis understood this unspoken rule. She never asked for acceptance, she conquered it. Her youth, then, was not a period of innocence, but of preparation. Every story, every scar, every whispered warning about her temper was a rehearsal for what was to come. By the time she reached full adulthood, Freydis had become a paradox. A woman of legendary blood, living on the periphery of civilization, yet dreaming of conquest. She was born into a legacy of exile but yearned for her own legacy, one that would not be tied to her brother's shadow or her father's rage. And when the opportunity came, when whispers of Vinland reached her ears, when she saw a chance not only to travel but to lead, she did not hesitate. This wasn't a pilgrimage. It was a campaign. In many ways, Freydis represents the final generation of the old Viking spirit, untamed, unconquered, and deeply pagan. The Christian world was closing in. Norway and Iceland were converting. Even Leif, her own brother, had embraced the new faith and its new codes. But Freydis was not interested in salvation. She wasn't interested in peace. She was a relic of an older time, and she knew it. That awareness would make her bold. It would make her dangerous. As this chapter draws to a close, one truth becomes impossible to ignore. Freydis did not stumble into infamy. She was shaped, molded, and sharpened by the environment around her. She was born into a family of violence and raised in a culture that celebrated ruthlessness. But unlike those who bowed to that system, Freydis learned to master it. Her youth wasn't a beginning, it was a forging. The blade had not yet been drawn, but it had already been made. In the next chapter, we will turn our gaze outward, to the world that awaited Freydis beyond the cold shores of Greenland. A world where Viking ambition collided with indigenous survival. A new land filled with promise, danger, and betrayal. Vinland. The new world. The place where Freydis would make her mark, not as a passenger, but as a predator. To understand the rise of Freydis Eriksdotter is to understand the furnace in which she was forged. The Viking Age, roughly spanning from the late 8th century to the early 11th, was not just a period of raids and plunder. It was an age of relentless movement, violent ambition, and seismic cultural transformation. Scandinavians surged outward in every direction, reshaping the political landscapes of England, France, Ireland, Russia, and even North Africa. They crossed oceans, navigated icy fjords, and clashed with empires far older than their own. This was not a time of quiet survival. It was a time of fire, of ships slicing through black waters, of villages set aflame at dawn, and of sagas born in the chaos of conquest. The Norse worldview was built on action. Their gods, their heroes, their legends, all praised those who seized fate with both hands. In this world, hesitation was fatal. Men who dared were immortalized in saga and song, while those who failed were forgotten. Courage was not just admired, it was demanded. A Viking's reputation, or drengskaper, was a currency more valuable than gold. Even death, if met with valor, offered glory in the afterlife. This cultural emphasis on boldness created a unique space for individuals like Freydis, those willing to risk everything, not just for survival, but for legacy. This era of expansion was not random. Scandinavia, with its limited arable land and harsh winters, could not support unchecked population growth. As chieftains grew in power, and younger sons found themselves landless, the impulse to look outward intensified. What began as seasonal raids soon evolved into full-scale colonization efforts. Settlements sprang up along the British Isles, Normandy, and the Baltic. Trade routes were established, kingdoms disrupted, and entire cultures reshaped. Amid this chaos, the Norse became both feared and admired: warriors, traders, poets, and kings. Nowhere was this spirit more evident than in the voyages westward. Greenland, where Freydis was raised, was itself a product of exile and expansion. Eric the Red had named it deceptively Greenland, in an effort to lure settlers to its icy shores. And while harsh, Greenland became a hub for a new generation of explorers, a launchpad for greater ambition. A lush land even farther west began to circulate, a place of wild grapes, forests, and endless promise. That place would come to be known as Vinland. The discovery of Vinland marked a staggering moment in Viking history. Long before Columbus ever set sail, Norse explorers had crossed the North Atlantic and reached the fringes of North America. According to the sagas, Leif Erikson, Freydis' half-brother, was the first to set foot there, describing a land of fertile soil and gentle winters. But this new territory was not uninhabited. The Norse encountered native peoples, known in the sagas as Skrælings, and the relationship would oscillate between cautious trade and brutal violence. Still, the Norse believed Vinland could be tamed. They saw it not just as a curiosity, but as a prize. Within this world of fire and conquest, Norse society was deeply stratified but fluid. A commoner could rise through valor. A chieftain could fall through cowardice. Reputation was everything, and opportunities were earned through force and vision. While men were most often at the forefront of raids and battles, women were not always confined to the background. As explored in earlier chapters, those who could match the ferocity of their male counterparts could carve out respect, and even fear. Freydis, raised in Greenland amid these stories of blood and honor, did not see her future in domestic silence. She saw it on the decks of ships and in the seizing of new lands. Vinland represented more than a new territory. It was a symbol, a blank canvas for the boldest Vikings to inscribe their legend. For the Norse, colonization wasn't just about survival. It was about imprinting their culture on the land. Building longhouses, carving runestones, planting crops, and raising children in foreign soil. It was an act of both ambition and defiance. Each voyage west was a declaration that the Norse spirit could not be contained by geography or fear. Freydis saw in Vinland not just opportunity, but destiny. The clash between the old world and the new would prove central to Freydis' story. The Norse did not arrive in Vinland as unquestioned conquerors. The indigenous peoples they encountered were formidable, knowledgeable, and fiercely protective of their homeland. For the Norse settlers, this was a test unlike any other. In Europe, they had the advantage of surprise and naval supremacy. In Vinland, they were the outsiders, and the cost of misjudgment was fatal. This tension created a pressure cooker, and within it, Freydis would act with brutal decisiveness. The sagas record multiple expeditions to Vinland, each with its own mixture of trade, settlement, and violence. While Leif's voyage is remembered for its relative peace, others, like Thorvald's and later Freydis's, were far more aggressive. Supplies were scarce. Winters were long. Communication with Greenland was limited to brief summer voyages. Every decision carried weight. Leadership mattered. And in this crucible of uncertainty, Freydis made her move. She was no longer content to remain in the shadows of her brother's glory. She would organize her own expedition to Vinland, on her own terms. Freydis's decision to take command was unprecedented and telling. While other women had traveled with Norse expeditions as family members or settlers, Freydis led. She negotiated ships, recruited men, and financed the journey. According to the sagas, she partnered with 2 Icelandic brothers for the mission, but the alliance would end in betrayal and blood. What matters here is that Freydis did what few women, or even men, dared to do. She seized the helm of history, fully aware of the risks, and fully prepared to enforce her will. In the broader context of the Viking Age, her actions were extreme but not anomalous. The Norse rewarded those who dared. Freydis was simply playing the same game, only harder, with fewer tools, and far higher stakes. She understood the expectations placed upon her as a woman, and she rejected them outright. She modeled her ambitions not on submission, but on conquest. In a time when survival itself was an act of aggression, Freydis chose not just to survive, but to dominate. The Viking Age, for all its brutality, was also an age of transition. Christianity was spreading. Monarchies were consolidating. The raw, decentralized power of the Old Norse world was beginning to fade. In this environment, the acts of individuals, particularly those on the fringes of the known world, could still shape legend. Freydis lived on that edge, and she exploited it. Her journey to Vinland was more than a voyage. It was a final expression of the wild Viking heart before it would be caged by kings and churches. By the end of this chapter, the stage is set. The viewer has seen the fire of the age, the wars, the discoveries, the cultural upheaval. We understand now that Freydis did not emerge from a vacuum. Her choices, her ruthlessness, even her violence, these were reflections of her world. In a culture that celebrated fearless action, she would go further than most were willing to go. In a society that honored boldness, she would become infamous. And in a world that rewarded legend, she would carve her name into eternity, not through words, but through blood. In the next chapter, we will follow Freydis across the sea, into the forests of Vinland, and into the heart of one of the most brutal and shocking episodes in Viking history. A tale of treachery, survival, and merciless resolve. The moment where Freydis Eriksdottir would forever become myth. The decision to sail west was never simple. For Freydis Eriksdottir, it was more than the lure of new land. It was a test of will, a gamble of legacy. By the time she prepared her own voyage to Vinland, other expeditions had already blazed trails across the Atlantic. Her brother, Leif Erikson, had returned from his journey with tales of forests, fertile ground, and rivers teeming with salmon. Others who followed brought back not just timber and stories, but warnings about harsh winters, strange native peoples, and growing tensions among settlers. Yet despite the risks, Freydis was not deterred. She saw not danger, but opportunity. Where others hesitated, she planned. Where others sought peace, she prepared for power. Freydis's voyage to Vinland was not an impulsive adventure. It was a meticulously planned campaign. She entered into a partnership with 2 Icelandic brothers, Helgi and Finnbogi, agreeing to a joint expedition in which each party would bring their own crew. On the surface, this alliance looked practical. Resources were pooled. Risks were shared. But beneath the agreement simmered mistrust, rivalry, and mutual ambition. Freydis was not one to yield control easily. And as the ships were readied and supplies gathered, it became clear that her intentions reached far beyond simple settlement. The journey across the North Atlantic was grueling. The cold bit through wool and fur. Storms crashed against the ships. Navigation was perilous. But those who survived the crossing landed in a land that felt untouched, ripe for transformation. Vinland, modern-day Newfoundland, was alien and beautiful, a world of dense forests, winding rivers, and unfamiliar skies. The Norse settlers quickly began to rebuild what they had left behind: longhouses, storage huts, fencing, and watchtowers. The settlement took root, but even in those early days, division was clear. Freydis and her men built their camp apart from Helgi and Finnbogi's. Separate sleeping quarters, separate stores, separate futures. The tension between Freydis and the brothers soon escalated. Disputes over resources and leadership began almost immediately. The Icelandic brothers, perhaps underestimating her, believed they could control the venture. But Freydis was not a subordinate. She was a force of nature. Every day she observed, calculated, and assessed. Her ambition, once cloaked in the practicalities of travel, now sharpened into something more dangerous. She hadn't come to Vinland to share. She had come to conquer. Despite the physical hardship, Freydis thrived in the wild. Her upbringing in Greenland had hardened her. Unlike many of the men around her, she had no illusions about the brutality of life beyond the fjords. She matched their labor, endured the cold, and showed no fear in the face of the unknown. This strength won her the respect of her crew, many of whom saw in her a leader more capable than the brothers. Quietly, her influence grew. She controlled the food supplies, dictated work schedules, and commanded loyalty not through title, but through presence. And with every passing week, the divide between the two camps grew wider. Then came the turning point, a series of events that would etch Freydis's name into infamy. According to the saga of the Greenlanders, Freydis accused the brothers of breaking a pact, specifically, of bringing more men on the voyage than had been agreed upon. This may have been true, or it may have been a pretext. But in Viking society, honor was sacred, and betrayal, real or perceived, was grounds for bloodshed. Freydis confronted her husband and demanded action. When he hesitated, she lashed out, physically beating him and insisting that he avenge her. Her fury was unmatched. Her orders were clear: kill the brothers and all their men. What followed was a massacre. Freydis's crew, acting on her command, stormed the rival camp in the early morning hours. Helgi and Finnbogi were slain. Their men, surprised and outnumbered, were butchered. The saga reports that only a few women survived, and even they were not spared for long. When her men refused to kill them, Freydis took up an axe herself and did what they would not. The bloodbath was total. She silenced every voice that might challenge her version of events. In one brutal night, Freydis seized complete control of the expedition. It is easy to judge her actions by modern standards. But within the logic of Viking society, her behavior, though extreme, was not wholly alien. Treachery was punished with death. Power was seized, not gifted. And legends were made not by restraint, but by the sheer will to dominate. Freydis had crossed a line few dared to approach, and in doing so, she ensured her dominance over the Vinland settlement, at least for a time. After the slaughter, Freydis kept her grip on power tight. She warned her men that anyone who spoke of the killings would face the same fate. The remainder of the expedition passed in relative calm. Crops were planted. Timber was harvested. Longhouses were repaired. But beneath the surface lay a rotting secret, one that would eventually return with them to Greenland like a curse. When they finally departed Vinland, their ship was filled not just with cargo, but with ghosts. Back in Greenland, the truth emerged. Freydis's actions horrified many, even in a culture used to violence. Leif Erikson, her brother, was reportedly enraged but chose not to exact punishment. Whether this was due to politics, family loyalty, or fear is unknown. What is certain is that Freydis's name was now forever split. half admired, half condemned. In one version of her saga, she is a heroine. In another, a butcher. Her legacy, like Vinland itself, exists on a blurry edge between myth and memory. Freydis's journey to Vinland was unlike any other woman's, not just because of her gender, but because of the sheer audacity of her actions. While others went seeking land, peace, or trade, she went seeking power. Her voyage was a conquest, not just of territory, but of history itself. She forced the sagas to remember her. She refused to be a footnote in her brother's legend. She would write her own, in blood and fire. By the end of this chapter, we see Freydis transformed. No longer just the daughter of Eric the Red, or the sister of Leif Erikson. She is her own myth now. Ruthless, commanding, unapologetic. Her expedition to Vinland was not just a side story in Viking expansion. It was a defining act in the twilight of Norse colonization in the New World. And though the Norse presence in Vinland would eventually fade, Freydis's story endured. Not because it was typical, but because it was unforgettable. In the next chapter, we will examine the fallout of her actions. How the stories of her brutality spread. How her name became both a source of fear and fascination. And how, even in a society built on male heroics, the saga of Freydis Eriksdottir refused to be silenced. The massacre at Vinland did not erupt from sudden chaos. It unfolded like a calculated play, orchestrated with patience, foresight, and lethal intent. Freydis Eriksdottir, already hardened by a life forged in the frost of exile and the shadow of legends, crossed a moral boundary few dared even to approach. This chapter in her story marks the transition from opportunist to architect of terror, a woman who didn't just survive history, but carved her place in it with blood. What happened in that settlement was not war. It was betrayal, sharpened like a dagger, hidden in the folds of alliance. The partnership with Helgi and Finnbogi had always been fragile. These Icelandic brothers, like Freydis, were ambitious. They shared her desire for land and legacy, but not her vision, and certainly not her need for dominance. The sagas hint at underlying distrust between them from the very beginning. Accusations flew. Promises cracked. But beneath the disputes lay a deeper tension. Both camps knew that only one would return from Vinland with power. The rest would either perish or be forgotten. Freydis understood this calculus earlier than anyone else. In the Viking world, honor was a currency, but so was fear. Freydis wielded both. She knew that survival in a land so far from home required more than brute strength. It required psychological supremacy. Her allies and enemies alike needed to believe she was not just dangerous, but inevitable. When her men hesitated to confront Helgi and Finnbogi over a supposed breach of their agreement, namely, that the brothers had brought more men than allowed, she framed it as treachery. But it wasn't the offense that mattered. It was the opportunity. Her manipulation began quietly. Freydis presented herself as the victim, wronged, dishonored, disrespected. She stoked the fury of her husband and her men, insisting that failure to act would be a stain on their honor. But when they still showed reluctance, fearing retaliation or divine consequence, she didn't argue, she demanded. The saga tells of a chilling moment where, frustrated by their hesitation, she beat her own husband into submission, physically and verbally, until he agreed to carry out the murders she had planned. That moment marked a shift. Freydis was no longer negotiating for power. She was taking it. The murders were swift, precise, and brutal. Helgi and Finnbogi were killed in their sleep, a quiet purge under the veil of night. But Freydis's thirst for dominance didn't end with them. Their entire crew, men, servants, and finally women, were hunted down. When her men balked at killing the women, she acted herself. According to the sagas, she picked up an axe and did what they would not. These were not acts of war. They were acts of dominance, coldly calculated and executed to erase any possibility of future challenge. It was not enough to win. Freydis needed to erase the memory of anyone else having ever contested her rule. There's a silence that follows mass violence, not just among the dead, but the living. In the aftermath of the massacre, Freydis issued a decree. No one was to speak of what had occurred. She ruled with the knowledge that fear, once planted, grows deep roots. Her authority in the camp became absolute, not because her men respected her more, but because they feared what she was willing to do to preserve her control. She turned the survivors into accomplices through shared silence. The voyage continued, but now every step carried the weight of unspoken guilt. The psychology of her rule is perhaps the most disturbing part of this saga. Freydis didn't appear to act out of rage or madness. She operated with strategic detachment. Her ruthlessness was paired with clarity. She knew exactly what she was doing, and why. By killing the rival leaders and their entire crew, she eliminated any threat to her claim over Vinland. But she also sent a message to her enemies, to her crew, and perhaps even to history itself. That message was simple. Challenge me, and you cease to exist. What sets this chapter apart in Viking lore is how deliberately it deviates from the warrior's code. Norse culture praised bravery in battle, but frowned upon treachery. There was honor in dying sword in hand, but less in betrayal while your enemy slept. Freydis's actions didn't fit the mold. She broke the rules of combat, and in doing so, rewrote the rules of power. She showed that in a world dominated by men and myth, fear could be a weapon more effective than steel. And yet, despite the horror of her deeds, the saga writers preserved her story. This is perhaps the most curious legacy of all. Freydis could have been erased. Her massacre could have been buried in silence or attributed to some anonymous villain. Instead, the writers included her story in graphic, uncomfortable detail. Why? Some scholars believe it was a cautionary tale. Others suggest it was meant to provoke awe, or serve as a twisted celebration of cunning. But it's also possible the scribes, consciously or not, respected her strength, even if they condemned her soul. There's also the question of how such a story survived oral tradition. Viking sagas were told and retold by skalds, poets and historians who often shaped stories to fit cultural expectations. Yet Freydis's tale endured, perhaps because it was simply too unforgettable to ignore. In an age where memory was power, she ensured hers would never fade. She didn't just outlive her enemies, she outlived her judges. Her tale, chilling and vivid, echoes not because it's typical, but because it defies all expectations. From a modern lens, Freydis's actions trigger moral revulsion. She killed unarmed people. She manipulated those closest to her. She wielded fear like a monarch wields law. But from within the Viking worldview, a world of blood feuds, exiles, and shattered oaths, she embodied something rare, unchecked agency. Freydis was not a woman trying to fit into a man's world. She was reshaping the world around her, violently, unapologetically, and on her own terms. Her betrayal in Vinland wasn't just a turning point in her story. It was a mirror to the fragility of alliances in Viking society. Trust was fleeting. Agreements were provisional. And loyalty often bowed before power. Freydis used all these truths as tools, crafting a legacy that could neither be erased nor fully embraced. As the chapter draws to a close, one thing becomes clear. Freydis Eriksdottir was not remembered because she fit the mold of hero or villain. She was remembered because she broke the mold entirely. She was a woman with the mind of a warlord and the heart of a storm, unpredictable, terrifying, unforgettable. In the next chapter, we will return to the icy fjords of Greenland and the quiet dread that followed her home. There, The consequences of her actions would begin to unfold. Not through vengeance, but through the slow erosion of trust, legacy, and the terrifying knowledge of what she was willing to do to win. In the bitter wilderness of Vinland, where the wind howled like spirits and the trees stood like ancient sentinels, history cracked open to reveal a moment so raw, so surreal, it has echoed across centuries. The story is simple on its surface. A woman, alone, pregnant, abandoned, surrounded by enemies. She doesn't run. She doesn't plead. She picks up a sword, exposes her chest, and screams, a primal, thunderous roar that sends her attackers fleeing into the forest. But within this story lies something more powerful than shock, a revelation of who Freydis Eriksdottir truly was. The attack came swiftly, like a storm on a quiet morning. Freydis and her group had returned to Vinland on another voyage, one not marked by betrayal, but tension. The native inhabitants, known in the sagas as Skraelings, had grown increasingly hostile. Trade had turned sour. Misunderstandings escalated. When the fighting began, the Norse settlers were caught off guard. Panic swept the camp. Warriors grabbed what they could and fled into the woods. In the chaos, Freydis was left behind. She was not in armor. She held no blade. Her body carried the weight of pregnancy. By all logic, she should have been the first to fall. But Freydis, as always, defied logic. Alone amid the chaos, she searched the ground and found what others had dropped in haste. A sword cold and heavy, still wet with blood. She did not lift it like a knight or raise it in silent prayer. Instead, she tore open her clothing, bared her chest, and screamed. This moment, seared into the Icelandic sagas like a scar, was not just an act of survival. It was an act of psychological warfare. The image is stark, a woman in the wild, confronting death not with retreat but with defiance. Her scream was not one of fear, but of domination. It wasn't a cry for help. It was a challenge. Primal, unfiltered, terrifying. The attackers, hardened warriors from an entirely different world, turned and ran. Not because she was stronger, but because she was utterly fearless. What can we make of this story? Did it happen exactly this way? Historians debate its accuracy, and rightfully so. The sagas are part myth, part memory, twisted through the lens of oral tradition. But whether it happened or not is, in some ways, irrelevant. What matters is that this was the moment the storytellers chose to preserve, a symbolic climax, one that defines Freydis not just as a historical figure, but as an idea. An archetype. She became the embodiment of a threat that cannot be quantified, not by blade, not by numbers, but by will. Psychologically, the act is fascinating. In a culture where strength was often measured by the sword arm, Freydis wielded something more complex, raw psychological dominance. By baring her chest, she exposed her vulnerability, but did so with such force that it became a weapon. She weaponized defiance itself. The scream wasn't just to startle, it was to overwhelm. To remind everyone, friend or foe, that fearlessness is contagious, and madness, in the right hands, is power. For the audience of her time, this moment would have been nearly unthinkable. Women, even in Norse society, which allowed more autonomy than most medieval cultures, were rarely placed at the center of combat narratives. Shieldmaidens existed in song and saga, but few were tied to specific events with such clarity. Freydis's moment stood out because it was unmistakably hers. Not shared. Not credited to male relatives. Not buried in allegory. It was her body, her voice, her will, that changed the course of that day. And what of the child she carried? The unborn life inside her during that scream is a haunting layer. It places Freydis not only between two worlds, war and life, but within them both. She was mother and destroyer, womb and blade. In mythology, such duality is reserved for goddesses and monsters. Yet here was a mortal woman enacting the same kind of mythic terror. Her scream wasn't just loud, it was generational, echoing forward into how Viking women would be remembered, feared, and misunderstood. Narratively, this moment is a cinematic peak. But emotionally, it's more than drama. It is where we finally see all sides of Freydis converge. The political manipulator, the brutal tactician, and the wild elemental force that refuses to be categorized. This is the moment that forces us to ask, what makes someone dangerous? Is it the sword in their hand, or the refusal to ever drop it, even when surrounded? Is it their ability to kill, or their ability to terrify? The scream in the forest became more than a moment. It became a myth, and in Norse culture, myth is immortality. That single act elevated Freydis from participant to legend. It reframed her previous betrayals, not as senseless violence, but as foreshadowing. This wasn't a woman who broke the rules of Viking society. This was a woman who understood that in the new world, there were no rules yet, and she would define them, one act at a time. There's something deeply unsettling about this transformation. Because in most historical narratives, women who commit violence are cast as villains. They are exceptions to be feared, not leaders to be followed. But Freydis did not seek approval. She did not need justification. Her scream wasn't a call to arms, it was a declaration of existence. And in that, she became more than feared. She became respected. Not despite her brutality, but because of it. In reflecting on this moment, we also reflect on our own biases. What would we have thought had this act been committed by a man? Would it have been heroic? Would it have been standard fare in a saga of conquest? And if so, why does it feel so different here? Is it because she was pregnant? Because she was alone? Or because we still struggle to understand that psychological power, when wielded by women, does not need to look like traditional strength? Freydis' scream is not just a sound in the dark. It is a rupture in narrative, the point where myth and reality collide. It's the moment where the story no longer belongs to chroniclers or kings, but to her. Alone, framed by fire and blood, she rewrote herself into history's most dangerous roles. And no matter how much time passes, that scream still carries, across oceans, across generations, across the fragile line between civilization and chaos. As we close this chapter, Freydis Eriksdottir stands not only as a Viking woman who defied death, but as a question mark carved into stone. Was she hero, monster, or something beyond both? And does her legend persist because she shocked her world, or because she understood it better than anyone else? In the next chapter, we follow the long shadows cast by her choices. How was she remembered when the blood had dried? How did her name survive in a society that had every reason to forget her? It's time to explore what it means to have a blood-stained legacy, not as rumor, but as enduring fact. Freydis Eriksdottir returned to Greenland not in triumph, but in shadow. The voyage to Vinland had ended, but not with discovery, not with prosperity, and certainly not with honor. Whispers followed her off the ship like spirits clinging to her boots. The massacre she orchestrated across the Atlantic had not remained a secret. Even in the Viking world, a society accustomed to violence, what she had done was unsettling. Her name carried weight, yes, but not the kind that built monuments. It was a weight that made people lower their voices when they said it aloud. Greenland, the wild and frozen outpost her father Eric the Red had helped settle, had always been a place for exiles and survivors. Freydis fit in better than most. She brought back wealth, goods taken from Vinland, possibly confiscated from those she had betrayed. She used that wealth to secure land, to fortify her household, to establish a legacy. But what she could never buy back was trust. Her presence was tolerated, not celebrated. She was feared, not followed. No one challenged her directly, but few stood close by choice. This chapter in her life is marked by a kind of cold consolidation, the gathering of influence not through glory, but through quiet intimidation. Freydis wielded her reputation like a second sword. People did business with her because they had to. They avoided conflict with her because they feared what she was capable of. In a brutal frontier society where strength was admired, her brand of strength was something else entirely. It wasn't admired. It was endured. And yet, she thrived. Unlike many Viking figures whose stories end in battle, Freydis lived on. She outlasted the expedition, the scandal, and even, it seems, the disapproval of her peers. There are no records of her being brought to justice, no saga of her falling in battle as penance for her crimes. That in itself is remarkable. In a culture that often demanded balance, honor traded for dishonor, life for life, she simply refused to pay the price. She never apologized. She never explained. And no one forced her to. This refusal to atone may be the most unsettling part of her story. Other violent figures in Norse tales often meet a poetic end. They die in battle. They sacrifice themselves for their kin. Their deaths, in some way, cleanse the blood they've spilled. But Freydis walks away from her darkest act and keeps walking. She does not seek redemption. She does not ask to be remembered as anything other than what she was. And that makes her dangerous in a new way, not as a threat to life, but as a threat to the narrative itself. Her relationship with her brother, Leif Erikson, illustrates this dichotomy perfectly. Leif, by contrast, is remembered as a builder, the discoverer of Vinland, a man of vision and tempered strength. His legacy is one of beginnings. He founded, he explored, he converted to Christianity and helped spread the new faith in Greenland. Leif is the kind of figure history loves. A man who crosses oceans and returns with stories that inspire rather than disturb. His name appears in textbooks, on monuments, even in American history as a precursor to Columbus. Freydis, however, is rarely mentioned, and when she is, it is in terms soaked with horror. This contrast begs the question, why? Both siblings traveled to the same land. Both participated in the same era of bold exploration. But where Leif is remembered as a pioneer, Freydis is remembered as a murderer. Certainly, part of this is due to their actions. But another part, a subtler, more insidious part, is due to how history digests ambition when it's wrapped in a woman's skin. A man who seizes power is called strong. A woman who does the same is called dangerous. Freydis never tried to control the narrative. She didn't write her own saga. She left that to others, and the versions we receive are filtered through time, bias, and discomfort. The saga writers, male, monastic, and often Christianized, had little space for a woman like her. She didn't fit their moral compass. She couldn't be turned into a saint, nor neatly condemned like a villain. So they preserved her with ambiguity, a terrifying figure who committed unspeakable acts, but one who still somehow survived without punishment. It was their way of warning the audience, not just about her, but about the very idea of power without repentance. As the years passed, Freydis became something of a legend within the Greenlandic community, a name that echoed in the longhouses during dark winters, a story to keep children obedient. And yet, behind the myth was a real person. Someone who had lived, bled, birthed, ruled. Someone who, even in isolation, maintained control over her land, her people, and her destiny. In a society where women were often absorbed into the identities of their husbands or fathers, Freydis stood alone. Her legacy was not written in runes or praised in poetry. It was whispered in hallways, passed down with unease. But it lasted. And that alone is a kind of power. After all, how many Viking women, how many Viking figures at all, are still spoken of with such intensity 1,000 years later? Her story survived not because it was celebrated, but because it could not be forgotten. We can imagine her final years as both formidable and lonely. The house she built may have been grand by Greenland standards, but it was likely silent. The friends she had once traveled with were dead, some by her own hand. The kin she shared blood with, like Leif, may have kept their distance. We don't know how often she spoke of Vinland, if at all. Perhaps she told her version of the events to her children, if she had any. Perhaps she defended herself in private even as she remained silent in public. Or perhaps she felt no need to explain anything to anyone. And this is where her story becomes not just historical, but philosophical. Freydis forces us to reconsider the shape of legacy. We often assume greatness must come with recognition, that history honors those who live by certain rules. But Freydis' survival, her command, her memory, all defy those rules. She didn't just succeed in spite of violence. She succeeded because she understood that power, in its purest form, is not always clean. It is not always redemptive. Sometimes it is brutal, unapologetic, and enduring. Her final act, if there was one, is lost to history. There is no record of her death. No grave site, no dramatic final battle. She may have died in her sleep, surrounded by the snow-covered silence of the Greenlandic frontier. Or perhaps her death, like much of her life, was more complicated, entangled in conflict or betrayal. But in the end, the silence surrounding her fate only deepens her legend. Freydis disappears from the record, but not from the imagination. When we compare her to Leif Erikson, the contrast is not merely between brother and sister, but between two visions of history. Leif's story fits the mold: noble, structured, morally digestible. Freydis's does not. Hers is raw, jagged, incomplete, but real. Perhaps more real than any sanitized tale of conquest. She represents the kind of past that makes us uncomfortable, the kind that doesn't resolve neatly, but demands reflection. As the chapter closes, we are left with a woman who claimed power and held it, who committed unspeakable acts and survived them, who rejected redemption and was never punished for it. In doing so, she becomes something rare. A legend that is not meant to inspire, but to challenge. A reminder that the past is not always filled with heroes and villains. Sometimes, it's haunted by people too dangerous to fit either role. In the next chapter, we'll look at how Freydis' story was preserved, and warped, by the saga writers, and how mythology, politics, and gender shaped her memory. We'll ask the question: who gets to become a legend, and who gets rewritten as a warning? By the time Freydis Eriksdottir's name appears in written history, it has already passed through many mouths, many years, and many agendas. She did not write her own story. Others wrote it for her, long after she had lived, fought, and vanished. In this chapter, we shift from Freydis the woman to Freydis the myth, diving into the two main sources that define her: the saga of the Greenlanders and the saga of Eric the Red. Each tells a different version of events. Each bends truth for a different purpose. Together, they form a puzzle of bias, politics, and legend, one that reveals as much about the people who wrote the sagas as it does about Freydis herself. The sagas were not written during Freydis' lifetime. In fact, they weren't even written during the Viking Age. Most of the Icelandic sagas were composed in the 13th and 14th centuries, hundreds of years after the events they describe. What had started as oral stories passed down through generations were finally committed to vellum by Christian scribes in a very different world. Iceland had converted to Christianity in the year 1000. By the time the sagas were penned, the old pagan warrior values had been filtered through the moral lens of medieval Christendom. This context matters immensely. The scribes were often monks or clerics educated in Christian doctrine. Their views on violence, gender and power were shaped not by the gods of Valhalla, but by the saints and sinners of the Bible. A woman like Freydis, violent, ambitious, commanding, did not fit the Christian mold of femininity. She was a threat, not just to morality, but to order. In this environment, recording her story was not a neutral act. It was a political and theological one. In the saga of the Greenlanders, Freydis is portrayed as cold-blooded and manipulative. She incites violence, betrays her companions, and justifies her actions with eerie calm. The narrative gives her no redemption, no reflection, only a grim summary of her treachery. Meanwhile, in the saga of Eric the Red, her role is minimized and altered. The more heroic scene, where she frightens away attacking natives while pregnant and armed only with a sword, appears in this version, while the massacre does not. This conflicting portrayal forces us to ask, which version is true? More provocatively, are either of them true at all? The answer may be, partially, but neither fully. Oral tradition tends to mutate with each telling, and as stories passed from one generation to another, details were altered to fit the audience. The Greenlandic saga might have emphasized her brutality to serve as a cautionary tale. The Eric saga might have sanitized or reimagined her to elevate her as a symbol of defiance. Both reflect deeper social anxieties, about women with power, about the dangers of unchecked ambition, and about the chaos that lurks when order breaks down. There's also the possibility that Freydis was a composite character, a symbolic figure rather than a fully historical one. Elements of her story echo older mythological archetypes: the warrior mother, the blood-stained queen, the cunning sorceress. These are women both feared and revered in Norse storytelling. Whether Freydis existed exactly as described or was shaped over time into a legend, her portrayal served a purpose. And that purpose may not have been to tell the truth, but to teach a lesson. The Christianization of the sagas cannot be overstated. Many early Norse tales were rewritten with subtle, and sometimes overt, Christian values inserted. Pagan gods were vilified or sidelined. Warlike heroes were punished for pride or greed. Women who defied their roles were either destroyed or turned into warnings. Freydis's bloody act in the saga of the Greenlanders mirrors the biblical trope of the dangerous woman, a kind of Norse Jezebel. She does not merely defy men, she destroys them. And the saga offers no space for forgiveness. But what if this wasn't meant to condemn her, but to preserve her power in another way? It's possible that the sheer force of Freydis's story, whether feared or admired, made her impossible to erase. Viking society may have transitioned into Christianity, but it still retained a fascination with figures who pushed boundaries. The fact that Freydis was remembered at all, in two sagas no less, suggests that her story resonated deeply. Her memory was preserved not because she was saintly, but because she was unforgettable. This duality is what makes analyzing her so complex. She is not simply a historical figure, nor merely a myth. She is a narrative battleground, shaped by competing ideologies and shifting cultural values. In Freydis, we see the clash between pagan valor and Christian morality, between oral tradition and written authority, between historical woman and literary character. The discrepancies between the two sagas offer more than just plot differences. They show how storytelling itself was weaponized. The saga writers were not journalists. They were curators of cultural memory, and every detail they included, or omitted, was a choice. The Greenlanders saga might have been aimed at an audience concerned with social cohesion, using Freydis as a warning against selfishness and brutality. The Erik saga, with its more heroic slant, might have appealed to audiences nostalgic for a wilder, freer past. And then there's gender. Freydis is one of the very few Viking women given such narrative attention. Most female figures in sagas are background characters. Wives, daughters, victims. Freydis is none of those. She is central. She acts, she commands, she kills. Her presence disrupts the patriarchal framework of the saga world. That disruption might explain why her portrayal is so charged and so inconsistent. Depending on the storyteller's intention, she could be anything from a demonic figure to a misunderstood hero. This raises a critical point about historical memory. It is never neutral. Every version of Freydis tells us more about the world that preserved it than about the woman herself. If she had been a man, would her violence have been excused? Would her ambition have been called leadership? Would her refusal to repent have been praised as courage? These questions linger because they expose the double standards embedded in history, and how those standards shape our collective memory. The blurring of history and propaganda in the sagas does not negate their value. In fact, it enhances it. When we recognize the sagas as ideological documents, reflections of anxiety, hope, and control, we can read them not just as records, but as cultural X-rays. They show us the bones of a civilization wrestling with its own identity. Freydis, in this light, becomes more than a character. She becomes a mirror. So what is the truth of Freydis Erik's daughter? Was she a bloodthirsty villain? A proto-feminist icon? A symbol used by saga writers to warn, scold, or inspire? The most honest answer may be, she was all of these, and none. She existed in a space between fact and fiction, between admiration and revulsion. And that is precisely why she still matters. As we leave this chapter behind, we are left with more questions than answers. But perhaps that's the point. History, especially Viking history, is not a straight path, but a winding trail marked by contradictions, silences, and competing truths. In Freydis, we find one of its most haunting examples. A woman who defied her world so completely, even the stories meant to define her could not agree on what she was. In the next chapter, we will explore the enduring legacy of Freydis in modern culture. How has she been remembered, reimagined, and reclaimed in books, films, and feminist narratives? How does her image challenge our modern ideas about women, power, and historical justice? As we close in on the conclusion of her story, the myth of Freydis is only beginning to awaken again. By now, the viewer has followed Freydis Erik's daughter through blood, betrayal, bravery, and the blurred lines between myth and memory. But to truly understand her impact, we must take a wider view, one that reaches beyond the icy fjords of Greenland or the wild forests of Vinland. This chapter places Freydis within a much older, broader, and more primal framework. The archetype of the dangerous woman, the female warrior who disrupts, defies, and disturbs. She is not alone in history. From Britain to the steppes of Central Asia, similar figures emerge. Women who refused passivity, who entered the realm of violence, and who left behind legacies laced with both awe and terror. We begin with Boudica, the Celtic queen who led a revolt against Roman rule in 60 CE. Like Freydis, Boudica was fueled by outrage and a sense of destiny. After the Romans humiliated her family and seized her lands, she rallied an army and burned cities to the ground. Roman historians described her with a mix of admiration and horror, a towering figure who embodied vengeance. Boudica's rebellion ultimately failed, but her legend endured, revived centuries later as a symbol of British resistance. Her story parallels Freydis's in how it challenges assumptions about femininity, leadership, and rage. Then there's Tomaris, the queen of the Masojte, an Iranian nomadic confederation from Central Asia. In the 6th century BCE, she confronted and defeated the Persian Emperor Cyrus the Great, a feat no male ruler of her time could claim. Her story, passed down by the Greek historian Herodotus, is both brutal and poetic. After defeating Cyrus's army and slaying him, she allegedly had his head submerged in a wineskin full of blood, declaring, "Drink your fill." This scene, half myth, half history, resonates with the same emotional extremity found in Freydis's saga. Both women are remembered not just for victory, but for symbolic acts that shook male empires. These figures, like Freydis, occupy a unique space in cultural memory. They are anomalies, women who behave like warriors in cultures that often restricted female agency. Yet these anomalies are strangely consistent. Across time and geography, similar traits emerge: maternal rage, defiance of oppression, a willingness to commit extreme violence, and a refusal to seek redemption. These women are rarely portrayed as balanced or peaceful. Instead, they are forces of nature, hurricanes in human form. In Norse mythology itself, this archetype is deeply embedded. Consider the Valkyries, fierce warrior maidens who ride through battlefields to choose who lives and who dies. Though they serve Odin, they are not meek servants. They are terrifying agents of fate. Their image mixes beauty and destruction, tenderness and terror. Freydis can be seen as a living echo of these mythic beings. Like a Valkyrie, she exists on the boundary between life and death, between the mortal and the mythic. And like them, she inspires both devotion and dread. Then there are the Shieldmaidens, semi-legendary female warriors who fought alongside men in Norse battles. Historical evidence for them is debated, but their presence in the sagas and in later literature suggests a cultural memory, or perhaps desire, for women who could step into masculine roles without losing their femininity. Freydis is often described as a shield maiden, but she pushes beyond that label. She doesn't merely fight beside men, she dominates them. She does not ask for permission or acceptance. She seizes power through cunning and brute force. In this way, she straddles multiple archetypes: the avenging queen, the monstrous mother, the tragic anti-hero. The tension between admiration and fear is central to how these women are remembered. They are rarely celebrated without reservation. Boudica and Tomarus, like Freydis, are often portrayed as exceptions to womanhood, not role models, but warnings. This framing serves a purpose. By casting powerful women as outliers or anomalies, society preserves its gender norms while still indulging in their stories. These figures are allowed to exist, but only at a distance and often in the past. Freydis fits into this pattern almost too perfectly. Her story is simultaneously preserved and condemned. She is remembered not for beauty, wisdom, or motherhood, the traditional Norse virtues for women, but for violence, ambition, and defiance. Yet despite this, or perhaps because of it, she endures. Her legacy, like those of her historical sisters, challenges the idea that danger is a masculine domain. Literature has also continued to explore this archetype, often with similar contradictions. From Lady Macbeth in Shakespeare to Eowyn in The Lord of the Rings, powerful women are portrayed as both heroic and unsettling. They either triumph through death or are tamed by love. The rare ones who refuse to submit, like Medea, who kills her children to punish her unfaithful husband, are portrayed as monstrous. Freydis shares this complexity. She is not a heroine in the modern sense. She is not a victim, nor a villain we can easily dismiss. She's a character forged from harsh realities, mythic storytelling, and centuries of moral interpretation. This chapter also invites viewers to consider how cultural memory treats male and female violence differently. Viking male warriors who committed massacres are often remembered as conquerors. Their brutality is contextualized, even romanticized. With Freydis, however, Her violence becomes the centerpiece of her legend. Her ambition is suspect, her cunning unforgivable. Is this due to the severity of her actions, or the fact that she was a woman doing them? That question sits at the heart of the female warrior archetype. The same traits that are praised in men, ruthlessness, courage, dominance, are often feared in women. And yet, the archetype persists. These stories survive and resurface because they tap into something deeper: the human fascination with rule-breakers, with those who defy the expected. The female warrior shakes the foundations of patriarchal order. She forces societies to confront uncomfortable truths about power, about fear, and about how stories are used to reinforce or challenge norms. In recent decades, feminist scholars and creators have begun to reclaim figures like Freydis. Instead of viewing her as an aberration, they see her as a symbol of possibility, a reminder that history has always contained women who defied limits, whether recorded or erased. Modern portrayals of warrior women, from film to literature, often draw from these ancient templates while reimagining them for a new era. Freydis' legend, with all its contradictions, fits neatly into this renaissance of dangerous femininity. So what does Freydis ultimately represent? Is she a historical woman shaped by myth? A myth with a historical core? Or a cultural archetype projected onto a violent past? Perhaps the answer is all of the above. Like Boudica, Tomarus, the Valkyries, and the countless unnamed Shieldmaidens lost to time, Freydis is more than a person. She is a story we tell ourselves about gender, power, and the cost of breaking rules. And like all great stories, hers refuses to be pinned down. She can be read as a hero or a monster, a warning or an inspiration. Her ambiguity is what gives her power, and what keeps her dangerous. In the final chapter, we will bring all of this together. We'll look at how Freydis' legacy survives today, in history books, fictional retellings, academic debates, and pop culture, and ask why, after all these centuries, we're still fascinated by her. The answer, like Freydis herself, is anything but simple. As the saga of Freydis Eriksdottir reaches its end, we are left with more questions than answers, and that may be the point. Her story is not a neat historical tale tied off with moral closure. It is jagged, contradictory, and unsettling. She stands among the most dangerous figures in Viking lore, not because of the lives she took or the blood she spilled, but because she broke every rule of how a woman, and even a leader, was expected to behave. In doing so, she carved a space for herself in a history that was never meant to remember her with honor. And yet here we are, still speaking her name. In the modern world, where history is increasingly re-examined through lenses of power, gender, and bias, Freydis becomes a kind of litmus test, not just for how we see the past, but how we define justice, ambition, and legacy. She was a woman who rejected repentance. A figure who was neither seeking equality nor fairness, but supremacy. That makes her difficult to admire in the conventional sense, and yet impossible to ignore. In this final chapter, we step away from saga scrolls and archaeological evidence and into the cultural and emotional echo she leaves behind. Freydis' relevance today stems in part from how fluid her identity is. To some, she is a proto-feminist icon, a woman who refused to be sidelined, who claimed leadership in a society that permitted but did not encourage it. To others, she is a cautionary tale, a brutal opportunist who used violence and fear to climb the social ladder, without remorse or principle. Both views are valid. Both reveal more about us than about her. Because Freydis, in truth, may never have been a character at all in the modern narrative sense. She was an idea, a myth constructed not just from facts, but from fear, admiration, and political necessity. And that is precisely why she matters. In every culture, there are historical figures who absorb collective anxiety. For the Vikings, and perhaps their later Christian chroniclers, Freydis became a figure through which to explore the threat of unruly women, the dangers of unchecked ambition, and the disruption of gendered order. She survives in the record not because she was erased, but because she was too useful to forget. She was a story people needed to tell, even if it wasn't entirely true. But in today's world, that storytelling power has shifted. Now we get to choose how we interpret her. In the age of media literacy, cultural critique, and historical reimagining, figures like Freydis are being recovered, not sanitized, but studied in their full complexity. She reminds us that history is not a fixed record, but a battleground of perspectives. Every generation reinterprets its past to serve its present. And in this moment, where conversations around women's leadership, moral ambiguity, and structural power are at the forefront, Freydis becomes more than a Viking relic. She becomes a mirror. What happens when a woman does not apologize? When she seeks power without couching it in virtue or compassion? Freydis forces us to reckon with our discomfort. She is not likable. She is not self-sacrificing. She does not lean in, she takes. And yet, her presence in the sagas, her ability to dominate the narrative centuries later, proves that she succeeded in a way few Viking women did. She made herself unforgettable. Her story also challenges the way we talk about violence. In so many histories, men who commit horrific acts are contextualized. The cost of war, the price of leadership, the burden of command. But when Freydis orchestrates a massacre, in cold blood, and with chilling logic, her actions are moralized. She becomes monstrous. This double standard forces us to confront uncomfortable questions. Is morality gendered? Is ambition only admirable when softened by empathy? Do we demand remorse from women in power because we fear what happens when they stop giving it? These questions echo beyond Viking history. In politics, media, and pop culture, women who exhibit Freydis-like traits, ruthlessness, dominance, and indifference to public opinion are still polarizing. They're called dangerous, difficult, or worse. Their counterparts, male leaders who wield the same tactics, are often seen as bold or strategic. Freydis' legacy helps us understand that these biases are not new. They are woven into the fabric of how we remember history. But to reduce Freydis to a symbol of injustice would be to flatten her. Her danger lies not just in what society projected onto her, but in what she actually did. She was not merely misunderstood, she was actively feared, even by her own people. And perhaps that's what makes her so enduring. In a world that praises redemption and neat moral arcs, Freydis remains raw and unresolved. She never explains herself. She never seeks forgiveness. She never recants. In that silence lies her power. The final image of her legacy is not written in stone, but in questions. What if she had been born in a different time, or with a different gender? Would her name be etched on monuments rather than whispered through sagas? Would she be hailed as a conqueror rather than remembered as a cautionary tale? Would she be a founder, like her brother Leif, or a forgotten ghost of a brutal past? Yet perhaps Freydis never wanted monuments. Perhaps her aim was survival, and beyond that, control. And in that she succeeded. While countless Viking men died forgotten in foreign lands, while kings rose and fell, Freydis endures. She lives in academic papers, dramatic retellings, speculative fiction, and now, this documentary. Her legend has outlived even the continent she helped discover. And that brings us to the heart of her legacy. The most dangerous people in history are not those who wield swords or command armies. They are the ones who understand stories. Freydis knew, perhaps instinctively, that fear is power. That reputation can do what steel cannot. That to be remembered, to be feared, is a kind of immortality. In this sense, her legacy is not fire and blood, but narrative. She shaped her image, or allowed it to be shaped, in a way that guaranteed its survival. In a world where information is power, that is a lesson worth remembering. Freydis's story teaches us that history is not a record of what happened, but of what people believed about what happened. And belief is far more potent than truth. That is why she still matters. That is why she is still dangerous. As we close, we leave the viewer with this challenge. Don't choose whether to love or hate Freydis. Instead, sit with her complexity. Let her disturb you. Let her fascinate you. Let her make you question your own ideas about heroism, leadership, gender, and history. Because that, above all else, is what dangerous people do. They don't just break the rules. They make you wonder why those rules ever existed in the first place. And for that reason, in the long twilight of the Viking Age, surrounded by legend and half-truths, one thing is clear. Freydis Eric's daughter is not done with us yet.